We're now just about 2 weeks removed from Sony's bombshell announcement that by the beginning of 2028, they would be moving to a 100% digital release schedule. A move Shawn, Layden, former president and CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment America, called a straight spreadsheet decision. And with that, we're still seeing the public backlash continue on with the ferocity it initially began with. PlayStation's Twitter feed is still an ongoing series of ratioed posts, with Sony often seeing thousands more comments than likes, along with community notes citing Sony's move to removing physical copies as a means of creating a digital monopoly. Anyone and anything that is either posted or retweeted by the official PlayStation account is either directly in the line of fire or catching strays, ranging from GTA 6 to Call of Duty to Pal World to Assassin's Creed Black Flag. No disc, no buy, F Sony and PlayStation's slogan, reworked to read, "Play has physical limits," are just a smattering of the memes and responses you see throughout their feed. We've seen Sony offering up 50% discounts to PlayStation Plus subscribers who have canceled the service in protest over Sony's decision to move to all digital, along with a Dutch antitrust lawsuit to the tune of $457 million, which is built on Sony essentially shooting themselves in the foot by removing physical media from the marketplace. You see, this was an interesting one that we talked about during the last upload, but Sony has been able to skirt around past lawsuits by pointing towards the physical market and outside sales and using that as evidence that they don't have a monopoly. But with them now moving to all digital, yeah, they performed a self-rug pull. However, make no mistake that the secondary market and physical media, along with giving gamers options to shop around and to actively find discounted games, is what's gaining the most traction here. As we've just seen another post hit from Game Rant that ran with the headline of, "Study reveals PS5 discs are much cheaper than digital games." They went on to quote games analyst Dr. 𝐓𝐡𝐮𝐽𝐬𝐢, who outlined the profit margins as the driving force as to why Sony would want to go all digital. Dr. Toto went on to say for physical game sales at retailers, the retailer gets to take at least 30% of the revenues versus if Sony were to sell a first-party title digitally, where they get to keep the full $70 or $80 purchase price. Those extra revenues shared with outside sales, along with higher production costs for physical discs and packaging, and the drive to all digital has a very clear motivation behind it: profits. But as we've recently seen with the RAMapocalypse availability and insane price hikes, giving too much power to a single source for products doesn't end up in a good place for consumers. It's not like Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron looked at the need for RAM and just saw how many devices worldwide depended on that RAM and said, we need to do the right thing here by making this affordable and available to everyone. Quite the opposite. DRAM prices have risen by a staggering 700% in a 4-year period, which is what many fear would happen with Sony and the PlayStation Store prices. You see, zero competition or availability to find cheaper games would mean consumers would then be tied to the PlayStation Store and its structure of rarely discounting games. And this has now led to a new antitrust initiative that is soon to be filed, this time coming from Mexican federal representatives. And the strength of the pushbacks and lawsuits shows no sign of slowing down, now actually reaching mainstream media. The move to all digital not only caught out many retailers and studios alike, but it also surprised Shawn Layden, former president and CEO of SEI, as he mentioned when he sat down for an interview with Eurogamer. Layden went on to say that he thought the decision to end production of physical discs was fairly dramatic and a spreadsheet decision, going on to say that he didn't feel that secondhand sales were a deciding factor in the recent decision and announcement made back on July the 1st. Layden also went on to say that Sony's decision to end disc production probably means it's making a PS6 console that doesn't have a disc drive. But an interesting point is that Layden also went on to speak towards what he is calling the tipping point, mentioning the percentage of opportunity versus the percent of the revenue source, which is one of the main counterpoint arguments to those favoring the move to all digital. As this GameSpot article goes on to say, Sony just reported a new record-breaking high figure, but it's unsurprising. According to this article, Sony has reported a record-breaking 85% of its PlayStation game sales were digital in Q4 of its last full fiscal year. However, that's not exactly the true figures here, because for one, this claimed 85% figure does not take into account if a game was actually offered as both a physical and digital release, or was it strictly digital. And from all reports we're seeing, there are significantly more all-digital offerings versus a game release that comes as both digital and physical. If the game is only offered as a digital release, the numbers will of course be skewed in that direction, of digital games being a more popular option than physical releases. But there's plenty of data to support the latter, like from the Insomniac games leaks that suggest the opposite, such as Spider-Man, which at that time was 54% physical, 45% digital, God of War Ragnarok, 76% physical, 24% digital, and even Astro Bot, which took home Game of the Year honors at the 2024 Game Awards, shows us that 55% of its game sales were physical to just 45% digital. So what we're seeing is that when given the options and an even playing field, gamers very often will choose physical at least as much as digital, if not more. More recently, posts like this have been popping up showing the breakdowns of PlayStation exclusives for physical versus digital. Ghost of Tsushima, Director's Cut, 71% physical to just 29% digital. The Last of Us Part 2, 61% physical to 39% digital, and the list goes on and on. Yes, there are instances where digital outweighs physical, but it's not as widespread as Sony makes it out to be, and it's certainly not a small percentage worth casting aside. When given the option, players like having that option to buy physical, especially because it gives them the ability to find better prices than what can be found through the PlayStation Store. Price and options is what is driving one of the core pillars of this massive community pushback versus Sony, as the PlayStation Store is consistently charging far more for games that can be found through outside retailers, as we once again turn to this recent Game Rant article that set out to compare 5 popular titles through outside retailers versus Sony's digital storefront. For instance, Red Dead Redemption, $24.99 at Walmart, $49.99 through PlayStation, which is absurd for a now 16-year-old game. God of War Ragnarok, $28.69 through Walmart, $69.99 through the PlayStation Store, and Hogwarts Legacy, $22.99 through Amazon, $69.99 through PlayStation. And of course, this list just continues on and on. Better prices can oftentimes be found outside the PlayStation ecosystem, and even though Sony is trying to frame this as an argument of nobody's buying physical media, it's really about control here. Control of the product, control of the prices, and control of the secondhand market, which once Sony goes to all digital will quickly crumble to nothing, and retailers are now speaking out about it. Video Games Chronicle just ran a piece saying that removing discs doesn't represent progress. UK retail group condemns PlayStation decision to stop making discs, calling Sony's plan a triumph of corporate convenience over consumer choice. According to the Entertainment Retailers Association, data shows that a quarter of gamers under the age of 25 use discs, and the total disc-based market was valued at over 300 million euros last year, demonstrating that there remains a substantial and committed audience for boxed games. Going on to say that consumers deserve the freedom to choose how they buy their entertainment. Removing discs doesn't represent progress, it simply removes choice. But for Sony, they seem to be married to the notion that nobody buys physical media, and because of that reason, they can push to an all-digital storefront and pocket 100% of the revenue instead of sharing with outside retailers. And if no competition within the tech and entertainment field is shown as nothing, it's that when these companies are left to their own devices, they go for the jugular. Look no further than the RAMapocalypse and pending lawsuit where Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron, who account for 90% of the worldwide RAM revenue, are now embroiled in a class action lawsuit for conspiring to fix prices on the supply of DDR3 and DDR4 RAM, resulting in significantly higher prices. Basically, everything we depend on these days uses RAM. Cell phones, computers, gaming consoles, hell, even your smart fridge needs RAM. And these companies have been getting away with murder by charging greatly inflated prices and keeping the public supply low to justify those prices. Which is why we see companies like PlayStation, Xbox, and even Steam looking to charge into the $1,000 plus range for the next generation of consoles, which is insane. For those prices, many within the gaming community are shying away from purchasing those next-gen consoles and instead looking to actually make that leap to PC gaming. Again, as Shawn Layden mentioned in his Eurogamer interview, the PS6 is looking to be coming without a disk drive, effectively negating a player's physical media library. But there's another concern here with this all-digital push, in that currently Sony won't let you change your PSN region. With physical copies, you could still play your games even when moving to, say, another country or halfway around the world, but using an account tied to a country you no longer reside in technically breaks Sony's terms of service. Now, most other gaming platforms have already addressed this, like Nintendo, which just lets you change your region with a few clicks on their website, while also keeping your library intact. Xbox and Steam also allow for legitimate region transfers, but with Sony and this move to all digital, serious issues could be seen by those moving, again, to other regions, especially if Sony decides to crack down by enforcing their terms of service, potentially tasking players with creating a brand new account and losing all access to their previously purchased digital libraries. That said, we've not only seen player-led initiatives like the Save Physical Games petition, which has now reached over 300,000 signatures, along with the community notes and responses PlayStation has met with anytime they post on various social platforms, but we've also seen various lawsuits and federal initiatives spring up as well. A Dutch consumer group has filed an antitrust lawsuit for $457 million, pushing back against the 30% markup on every game sold through the PlayStation Store, dubbed the Sony tax. Brazil is also seeking to enact a series of requirements against Sony in an attempt to protect that country's gamers against those players losing access to their games once PlayStation determines they have reached end of life, including offline modes and possible refunds. We learned today that Mexico is now also pursuing their own recourse against Sony and its all-digital push, seeking to file a formal complaint with that country's antitrust authorities, referencing Sony's removal of purchased content for European users back in 2022, along with the more recent announcement that Sony's licenses for over 500 movies and TV shows had not been renewed, so the purchased media had therefore been removed from consumers' libraries without prior notice and with no ability to get a reimbursement. One of the representatives leading this new call to action went on to say that, quote, Sony would become the referee and the player within its own ecosystem, and we know what can happen when a single company controls every part of the market. Yes, we certainly do. Now, by forcing everything to become digital, the assumption is that everyone has access to reliable high-speed internet when we know that isn't a reality throughout Mexico. Furthermore, eliminating physical games would effectively destroy the markets for resale, lending, and collecting physical copies. As a result, Sony would become the sole price setter for games sold on PlayStation. This new complaint also goes on to mention the developers, who would also be put at a disadvantage, becoming entirely dependent on PlayStation's digital infrastructure, subject to platform commissions and any commercial terms Sony chooses to impose in order to reach players. That quote mentioning that Sony would then become both the referee and the player in its own ecosystem is exactly what they're attempting to do. Removing all the other players from the field and decimating the retail and secondhand market is something that they've shown they're willing to do in order to gain full control of their games, while, as we've seen, charging full price for games that have long since seen their prime, all in an attempt to chase their end goal, profits. Will this latest federal initiative turn into another lawsuit? And what do you think of the Sony decision to push for all digital? Leave a comment and let's see where the community is landing on this one. If you happen to like the video, please consider hitting subscribe and ringing the notifications bell. And I'd also like to say thank you to all of our hardcore channel supporters. Until the next one, this is 𝐓𝐡𝐮𝐦𝐻 Light Beer, signing off.